So tonight we are going to have the last of the 3 lectures in the middle part of the class. The first 2 have involved people who run family farms, as you know, small family farms, and they told you their story. They told you about the way that they have to do things. What they do is what they love to do, as you learned, and you understood, I think, from what they said, that they are not following the conventional pathway in terms of what agriculture has been perhaps in the past, but they're turning in new directions. In fact, the NPR piece, which I directed you to, talked about the family farm that revolutionized agriculture, referring to the Matsumotos. Now, you might have been tempted to think, I can understand this, that these are abnormal, that these are, sure, they're nice family farms, they're small, and they work well, and the people love what they're doing, but they're not typical. Well, 2 weeks ago, the USDA came out with its most recent census of American agriculture, and this particular part had to do with what's called farm typology. Now, you can read it online, but I'll tell you a couple of things. First of all, they said that of the 2,100,000 farms in the United States, 97% are family farms. Of those family farms, 88% are small family farms by their category. Okay, so what the people you were listening to are not atypical. They are the vast majority of what farming is in this country. They are the way things are done. Also, and I think this is very nice, 1/5 of the family farms are people who became owners and operators of their farms within the last 10 years. So things are changing. They're different. They're changing. There's change in the air. And tonight, what we're going to have is a kind of synthesis, I think, of all of these ideas that the farmers were telling you about, that you met, Carl and Helen, Nikiko and Mas. And we've got, I think, someone outstanding to do it because he is not only a professor of agroecology, he's also a farmer. So we have yet a 5th farmer coming in this second part of the class. Now I'm going to ask Mark Bittman to introduce him. So please welcome Mark back to the class.
Thank you, Gary. I'm here to welcome Steve Gliessman. I've been credited with inventing a couple of terms in the food world, and neither of those times was it true, but here's something that is true. With a couple of other people, Steve Gliessman invented the word agroecology. Actually, since he was in Mexico at the time, he invented the word agroecologia. And that's a pretty incredible thing. I don't think he would claim to have invented the concept. That would be saying too much. And he probably didn't invent the concept of fair trade coffee either, but he did pretty much invent it, if not single-handedly, then again, very early on. This is not a classic academic ivory tower guy. Before sustainable agriculture was a cool thing to do, Steve determined that there was a close relationship between traditional agriculture and what we now call sustainable agriculture. And today he's just about the most articulate and knowledgeable representative of what might also be called intelligent agriculture. When I say that, I mean agriculture that produces nutritious food sustainably and fairly. You might think of agroecology as a smarter and more comprehensive form of organic. But I'll leave it to Steve to make that distinction, and we'll have time for both discussion and questions and answers afterwards. Formally, Dr. Gliessman has graduate degrees in botany, biology, plant ecology from UC Santa Barbara. He's been teaching and researching for more than 40 years, much of that time in Central and South America. He founded the agroecology program at UC Santa Cruz. His textbook, Agroecology, is in its 3rd edition. It's a standard. It's been translated into many languages. And he's the editor of the international journal Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. As Gary mentioned, he's also an organic grape and olive farmer in Santa Barbara County. Finally, he's a wonderful and generous guy, directly responsible for one of the best and most instructive stories I've ever written. That story came directly out of his understanding of and his wisdom about traditional agricultural systems, and not only how they're still relevant, but how they're profoundly important. He's giving generously too of his time and being here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Steve Gliessman.
Have fun. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thank all of you for being here tonight, and especially the folks who've been behind making this course happen for the last several years. Gosh, Alice and Bob and Gary and a bunch of other folks who've really made this course happen. And thinking about the movement that Gary mentioned, that Mark mentioned, there is change in the air. And I want to spend a little time this evening kind of thinking about where that change has come from and how it's developed. And as Mark said, a lot of my beginnings in agroecology, I guess, began in southern Mexico, side by side with traditional Mayan farmers, in what I'll call an intercultural adventure, sharing different forms of knowledge, sharing different experiences, different ways of looking at the world we manage in our hands that we call farms. So beginning here with a little bit of talk about this term, agroecology, and a definition that I've used for a long time, using ecology, the principles and concepts of ecology, to design and manage sustainable agroecosystems. That's kind of the oldest definition, I think, and it has appeared in many forms. It has several parts to it. Ecology, the science of how nature works. I like to think about it that way. And we take that science and we use it to design agroecosystems, food systems, farms, places to produce and grow food. And once we've designed them, we manage them. We manage them using the same principles and concepts. And behind all of it is this term agroecosystem, the term that, gosh, I guess it has its roots in the early 1970s, coming from ecologists, but my main experience was it coming from a maestro, a guy who was a Mexican indigenous person trained in ethnobotany, an agronomist who looked at farms as food systems, as agroecosystems. And then the term sustainability, one that I think you all have been reading about, thinking about, and trying to live maybe in the way you approach your own food. Sustainability, a real important part of the definition of agroecology. But then what do we have to look forward to when we have this global food system? Food produced all year round, everywhere on the shelf at the market. How did that come about? Is that agroecology? And how does our agroecological understanding help us look at this system of food and help us look at large-scale monoculture, genetically modified corn in the central part of this country and in other parts of the world as well? Single crop stands as far as you can see, where everything is focused on production. And it's not even directly food. Something to think about. And how different that is from the food system, the farm that was one of my major teachers in southern Mexico. Their traditional corn, bean, squash intercrop, the Three Sisters, and where we did some of our first agroecology, side by side, participating with farmers in their fields, with their crops, with their seeds, with their practices, and with our science, sharing different forms of knowledge, an intercultural experience that taught us both about the science of agroecology and the practice of agroecology. This system, gosh, I could talk all night about it. All of the things going on, interactions, relationships, symbioses, mutualisms, incredible stuff happens in that system as the result of a long-term cultural practice of observation, trial and error, choosing what works best, local adaptation in a cultural context. So agroecology, thinking about the ecosystem concept. If you study ecology, it's first thing you look at. an ecological system of interacting living and non-living components. And we've taken that concept and expanded it to the agroecosystem, which I like to think of as an ecosystem with a purpose, with a purpose of producing food. And now we're seeing it's a multifunctional purpose, producing a lot of other environmental services as well that I'll talk a little bit about. Interesting to think about. I used to argue with ecologists about how agroecosystems are really much, much more complex than ecosystems. And they say, what do you mean? They're simplified ecosystems. I said, no, they're not. They have the component that complicates them, which is people. Yeah? So they are pretty darn complex. And using the ecosystem sort of diagram on the right, that's something that's been standard since Eugene Odum first published his ecology book in the 1950s. This idea of interacting components, capturing solar energy, converting it to plant matter, being consumed, being transformed to other matter, storing energy for a period of time, cycling nutrients, levels of complexity and relationship and interaction that drives ecosystem. And we take that concept and we think about how the consumption in markets where we produce to remove from the system, how it changes the ecological character of a system, and how we've compensated for that loss from the system that normally would be recycled within the system by a whole set of incredible human inputs, especially fossil fuel-based inputs, to keep those systems functioning. But as a result of comparing these two pieces, I like to think about a general principle. It's not a law, it's not a rule, but it's something that's guided my thinking, that the closer we design an agroecosystem to the way nature is designed in that place, the more likely that it's going to be sustainable, or at least more sustainable. Use nature as our model in designing that system, but then taking that nature as model component and adding a cultural component to it, and do something that I like to call cultural agroecology, linking culture and ecology through an intercultural process. That intercultural process of sharing different ways of knowing, of learning, of understanding the nature that we live in and work with. And it takes forms like diversity versus simplicity in terms of genetic variability in a system. And instead of a single line in a system, multiple lines in time and space. Or dependency versus autonomy, ecological and cultural terms, where a system can develop resilience and food security, a home garden system in southern Mexico, a small area, probably smaller than this room, producing 125 to 150 different species of plants, 5 or 6 or 7 animal species, all integrated in an agroecosystem called a tropical home garden. Or this system, which looks pretty much like a forest, but I like to call it a coffee forest, a community we work with in northern Nicaragua, where multiple layers, multiple relationships, the key crop from a cash perspective is coffee, integrated into that system, but it allows for a closed, self-sufficient system rather than an open input intensive system based on a whole lot of ecological and cultural relationships, to a landscape level of a whole community where traditional versus industrial approaches to agriculture come together in a multifunctional landscape with home gardens close to the homes and small fields with individual crops or mixed crops for market and home consumption, in an area for animals close to the river or to the lake, and then mountainside agriculture in a forest reserve, all considered part of a multifunctional agricultural or human landscape. And out of that, the first edition of my textbook came out in the 1997, I think it was. And you notice the cover was that traditional corn, bean, squash system, reminding me the importance of that system and how it exemplifies agroecology to a certain extent, both ecologically and culturally, and focusing on the ecological processes in a sustainable agriculture. Using agroecology, then, in a process of transition, of change, or conversion of a non-sustainable system to a sustainable system. When I came to Santa Cruz in the end of 1980, and shortly thereafter started working with this crop, strawberries. 1985, we started a project with a grower to produce organic strawberries. What do you mean? Everybody grows organic strawberries. Well, at that time, we were told, you can't do it. Don't even bother. Well, this farmer was committed to doing it. He had a whole history of reasons why he wanted to move in that direction. We had the idea of understanding the transition process. How different from conventional fumigated strawberry fields, monoculture strawberries, as far as you can see, and the ecological impacts of that fumigation, just to think about how agroecology can look at a system like that to tell you what's not working as much as it can to tell you what is. And so we set up with the farmer on his field, with his practices, his experience, and our science, a side-by-side comparative trial of a piece of land in conversion from conventional management, happened to have a long history of Brussels sprouts, into strawberries, side by side. Studied everything we could because we didn't know what we were going to find in terms of transitions in that time. Underground, above ground, insects, diseases, nutrients, plant response, yields, fruit quality, you name it, we looked at it. And came up, while we were doing the study, doing an economic analysis as well. And from the first year of a 3-year study, we showed that the organic grower could produce as much, and in some years more, return on investment as the conventional system. And when that started to happen, the conventional strawberry industry accused us of falsifying our data. And it took us 5 years to finally get it published in the conventional journals. Well, you keep at it. That resistance that I talked about a little bit in that article that I had you all read. And then thinking about what strawberries could look like with this approach. A complex system of rotations and crop associations. Not strawberries year after year after year that fumigation allows, but a rotational system. The way strawberries were grown before, methyl bromide was developed for fumigation. And relearning how to do rotations and which ones work and how you can make sure they work using the science and the practice coming together, embedded in a natural landscape where nature is part of the system as well. And out of that experience, we developed this protocol for the study of systems in transition, thinking about level 1, which is where I think many agronomy schools might still be stuck, but they certainly were completely in this area when we started our conversion studies in 1985. Taking conventional practices and, yes, trying to improve them, cutting costs, maybe lessening environmental damage, but it's still a conventional approach, and it's usually a monoculture approach. With our strawberry grower in Santa Cruz, we developed level 2, where the idea, of course, was to substitute conventional inputs and practices with alternatives. Alternatives, in this case, which met organic certification standards. And that gave us the pretty important goal to shoot for. And we got to a point where, yeah, you could take out chemical fertilizers and put in compost, but it's not the same. It stimulates a whole different set of interactions at the soil level. And you have to learn how to manage them and deal with them and understand them, especially after a couple years of strawberries. And what are your indicators to tell you that it's time to move into another crop, and which crop? All kinds of stuff. And we reached a point where, though, at level 2, the system design hadn't changed. It was still monoculture strawberries. And problems that presented themselves in level 1 also presented themselves in level 2, and oftentimes more intensely because you didn't have the same type of input to control them. So this is what led us into level 3. Redesign the system using ecological concepts and principles so that the system itself resisted the problems. And that's where diversification, rotation, just a whole set of different interactions became part of the management. And then thinking in different systems around the world where this approach could be used and is being used. Olives in southern Spain, monoculture, dry farmed olives, compared to a place in Italy where the traditional practice is olives, grapes, and in between, usually in the spring, oats or wheat. Gosh, think about it. There you've got your bread, your olive oil, and your wine. What else do you need? Coffee. Huh? Maybe. Or rice, which can be grown in large-scale monocultures, in this case in southern Brazil, compared to the traditional Chinese rice system with a fish pond and rice paddies and vegetables and a rotation between all three of those that takes place over time, and a home garden system with a diverse set of perennial crops. Some of them, for example, silkworms being grown on mulberries, and the waste from the silkworms going into the fish pond. And all these parts are connected. And the question is, why this when we know this is an option? Or it was for such a long time? What drives that change? Or coffee, get back to that. Where so much of the coffee, remember, is a plant that evolved in the shade of trees and forests in the mountains of Ethiopia. And now it's being grown in full sun in southern Brazil. Yet small growers have learned how to kind of simulate, using nature as their model, growing coffee in the shade and diversifying that shade. So it's not only producing shade, it's producing food, it's producing organic matter, it's producing firewood, it's producing medicinal plants, a whole lot of different things. And I remember when the farmer on the right there, Don Roberto, told me one day, if I could get more money for my coffee, I could plant less coffee. And I could plant the things that my farm needs and my family needs, and I could sell locally in my community, and I wouldn't be so dependent on coffee. Well, that gave me a lot to think about. Again, that learning from other sources of knowledge. And developing in the process of this conversion indicators of sustainability to tell us if we're moving in the right direction. And the first 4 here are ecological indicators. And we have tools in ecology for measuring most of these, from soil quality to indices of diversity. The last 3, though, economic, social, and cultural resources as indicators, those are a little more complex. Econometrics gives you some way of evaluating if you're getting a return on your investment, but then there's ecological economics, externalities, return on investment that's different. And then social resources. What are your indicators of a healthy society connected to food? And how is that connected to a cultural process of learning and sharing and passing on that knowledge? So I remember when Charles Francis and a group of us, we put out this little paper called Agroecology, the Ecology of Food Systems. And it really pushed me away from just using the term agroecosystem, which a lot of people just think is an ecological term. And that even though I mentioned that people were the complicating factor in agroecosystems, agroecosystem as a term didn't really get people thinking beyond the farm. And that's when we started thinking about the whole food system. The food system, from the seed and the soil all the way to the table and back again. A whole system, and understanding what drives that system, using an ecological perspective of interrelationships and interactions and feedbacks and all that to really move on. And it made me look at the strawberries in a little different area. This is only up to 2003 on this map, a number of acres of organic strawberries. We started our study back in 1985, it was 0. And look at it, 1997 it was only 134 acres. Well, in 2011, the last data that I have, it's 1,638 acres. But this is the piece that really made me think about the fact that number of growers increased. Probably was 1 or 2 back in 1985, up to 119 in 2000, and started dropping. And by 2011, it was down to 95. And I think in the present, it's probably dropped even a little more. What's that tell you? Fewer growers, more acres. It's being concentrated in fewer hands. And there's a whole set of likely players in that process that I won't go into. But they're usually the big scale, vertically integrated organizations that control the strawberry market. So that led us into the second edition of the book, came out in 2007, with a different subtitle, The Ecology of Sustainable Food Systems. And the cover now, still got the corn, beans, and squash down here on the right, but it's got people in it at the market. It's got animals in it. It's got small-scale agriculture. It's got larger-scale agriculture, giving us a whole different way of thinking about the food system. And we added another level to that conversion process, that transformation process, one that focuses on the 2 most important parts of the food system, in my opinion, the people who grow the food and the people who eat the food, who for so long have been so separated and isolated from one another, they don't have the slightest idea where the eaters, for example, where the food comes from, how it was grown, or anything else. And the producers, the growers, they don't know where it goes. They've been completely separated. And the idea of this level 4 is to reconnect those 2 in a relationship-based food system, marketing system, where there's a whole different way of developing alternative food networks. And you've seen it, you're doing it. Direct markets such as farmers markets, CSAs, the whole local agriculture or relocalization movement, I like to call it. The development of food hubs that aggregate food from small farmers and then redistribute it directly to consumers. And the whole idea of urban and peri-urban agriculture, bringing home the process of growing, processing, and consuming food. So that rather than just thinking about the price on the market, we look at what's behind the product. Who grew it? How did they grow it? How does making the choice to buy from that farmer, be it he or she, make a difference for them? And I think you probably heard about that a little bit from the last two sessions of how important that relationship is for the success of small farms. And we see it in lots of parts of the world. A farmer's market in southern Mexico with a family at the stand selling things that all came out of their home garden system. Or farmers markets, this one in Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz now has at least one, sometimes two farmers markets every day of the week. And they've just exploded. And yet, not enough people go to them when you think about how many people are eaters. Or one like this in southern Brazil, which kind of helps farmers in the sense it's farmers' organizations. Small farmers form small associations of 15, 16, 17 farmers. So a farmer doesn't have to go to the market every time. One of the farmers in the group can represent them, and they aggregate their produce. And it's a group of small farmers with very strict controls over who grows, who sells, and how food's grown. So we begin thinking of this food system as a global system, interactive, interconnected, and it's sort of holistic if you think about it. And it gives us, I think, a foundation for change, for action, for simultaneously developing alternative food systems while providing at least a model for what the industrial monocultural system could be or needs to be, so that we can move from a primary focus of production and profit. And I claim that's what conventional systems are concerned about and primarily only concerned about, production and profit, to one of focusing on food security, food sovereignty, nutrition and health, and ultimately sustainability. So that's led us into the third edition that just came out, a month and a half or so ago. And notice now the photograph is actually a farm landscape of that farmer in southern Costa Rica who told me if he could get more money for his coffee, he could grow other things besides coffee. And this is an aerial photograph taken with some of the new, you're using a little drone and special cameras and all that good stuff, huh? But you see a forest, you see a farm field, you see the coffee, you see a stream flowing, you see annual crops, you see animals. It's all there. It's an incredible integrated landscape that, because he's been able to get better money for his coffee, can depend less on coffee in the development of this system. So based on this, we've added a fifth level now, kind of the ultimate level, I think. Maybe, we'll see. But it's one in which we build upon the foundation built by the first three levels at the farm level, and then add the fourth level in terms of sustainable food relationships, and really start focusing on building a new global food system. And I mean global, because food is interconnected throughout the world. Based on resilience, participation, localness, fairness, and justice, that's not only self-sustainable as a food production system, but since it's connected and integrated across the landscape, it helps protect Earth's life support systems as well. So the future of food's much, much more than ending hunger, although that's an important goal. And the future of food's much more than just increasing production, which is also an important goal. It's really taking in our own hands, and I know many of you are thinking about how can you as an individual have an impact on the food system. Well, that's the next step for all of you. An example, a nonprofit organization that my wife Robbie and I co-founded, 15 years ago now. Robbie's here, making sure I don't invent anything. But can you imagine a small nonprofit that was started by a group of graduate students and us, working in Latin America, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Mexico, where we you wanted to apply agroecology. You wanted to do agroecology in these communities using participatory, action-oriented approaches to determining what the problems were, what the potential solutions were, and how this was contributing to change in our food systems. Lots of different examples from corn in the Yucatan and the importance of local varieties and the milpa system, they call it, the corn system, where it's not just corn, it's a whole lot of things all integrated into the landscape. Coffee, and how there's something that we could maybe call sustainable coffee, which is really a different definition than what Starbucks calls sustainable coffee. You really got to get into asking quite hard questions about when they use those words, what do they mean? And what proof do they have that it really is backed by our agroecological understanding? And empowering farmers to take charge of their product and not just be at the mercy of an intermediary by developing alternative market systems and involving young people back and forth interculturally, with linking our university students at Santa Cruz with youth from the communities that are becoming the leaders of the food systems, and using this participatory action research approach, PAR, where from the very beginning we sit down with the community that we're working with and together decide what is it we're going to research. We don't come with a research agenda. We come with an agroecological focus, but the actual research agenda is developed together in a participatory way. It takes time, it takes trust building, it takes work to come up with, but when you finally reach an agreement and move forward into research, reflecting on the research itself, and then moving into the changes, and then starting the process again, and then distributing out and sharing it beyond the community you're working with. That's a network. That's an agroecological network. And the communities we work with has actually developed a brand of coffee, Agroeco coffee. How about that? And I think it's for sale at the farmers market here in Berkeley on the weekends, thanks to one of your TAs. You should check it out. Where, again, unique in the sense that everybody's at the table when we talk about the price the farmers are going to get. The farmer cooperative or association, the exporter, the roaster, and us, all together, coming up with something that I like to think of as beyond fair trade, because it's truly the participation of everyone in the food system in the process. And it's even created a couple funds, one a sustainability fund that the community uses for projects in the community, and a payment fund for unpaid work of women. Can you imagine? Women who normally are not even recognized for the work they do during the coffee harvest, including harvesting the coffee, but everything else that supports the family. This is a fund that they, as a group of women, choose how they're going to use it for bettering of their community. That's all worked into the price that you pay when you buy the coffee. And then our nonprofit has always had these essential components of you need social organization, that social resource, an interesting indicator of sustainability. And it has to include broad participation of all members of the community. Transparency and trust, which takes time to build and sometimes doesn't work. And you can invest a lot of time and energy in a community and then things fall apart. That's the nature of community-based work, really. But it builds capacity. You build capacity in the research itself. Young people in the community become the researchers, working alongside the researchers, taking data, analyzing it. And we just had a student go down with a bunch of laptops, or not even laptops, tablets that'll be used to gather the data and transmit it. And so it gets put into a context that gives us more information for change, which is then shared across knowledge systems and networks. I always like to think about this forest below Pico de Orizaba in Veracruz, where we're working with a couple communities. And that's a coffee forest. It's got native species as the cover, but underneath is coffee. And around the edges are a series of other kinds of crops that contribute to the livelihoods of the folks in these communities. Multifunctional landscape, conserving resources, conserving soil, producing water, sequestering carbon, all the things that we call environmental services should be rewarded, should be recognized and included in the price that those folks receive for their coffee. Now, all of you are interested in education, and I like to think of action education for sustainable food systems. Action in the sense that you're learning it for not just for knowledge's sake, but to do something, to create change. And it can begin and needs to begin at the school garden level. And Robbie was one of the co-founders of Life Lab in Santa Cruz. And in the edible schoolyard programs here in Berkeley, how they've been models of how to engage students at early ages in this whole process of food system change, not just how to plant a seed, something much more beyond that. And the system at UC Santa Cruz has been in place for over 40 years. Now the Farm and Garden program with all its diverse organic management, an important place for training and demonstration and transfer of knowledge. And I know that here at Berkeley now, with the Giltrakt land and the idea of it potentially becoming a center for urban agriculture and food justice, and how that, to me, really honors the roots of agroecology here at Berkeley that started at the Division of Biological Control at the Giltrakt and was brought here years ago by Dr. Miguel Altieri. So linking those together allows you to do things like we've done for years at Santa Cruz, teaching classes that are hands-on, field-based, where the experiments of agroecology, the students plant. They care for them. They take the data, and of course they harvest the crop, weigh it, and then take it home and eat it. So you get to follow the whole process. And here in California, we have that ability, and every campus needs a place for that kind of thing to happen. And putting students together with farmers, graduate students in this case on the right, sharing information about some aspect of the farm and getting perspectives from both sides so that they learn together. And one of the things we've done as part of our nonprofit is sponsored an annual intensive 2-week agroecology course, and the 16th one of them is happening this summer in Santa Cruz in July. And you could actually get academic credit for that course through the University of Vermont, where we have one of our partner organizations having set it up now so that you can do that. And there's a place to get information about that course. Now, that's all the training piece, but I wanted to jump real quickly into another issue. This just came out in the paper this last week. It kind of shows Hotel California, which is kind of the capital over there on the left, a dry groundwater system. And over there, I heard this in the news a few weeks ago, we're facing a catastrophe, experts say. We've only got enough water for 1 year, and if we don't take drastic steps, we're done for. And of course, what's one of those steps? Reuse your hotel towels, please. Is that where the real issue needs to be solved? When 80% of the developed water of California is used by agriculture, and it's used by an agriculture that's not sustainable, and it's used by an agriculture that, until legislation was passed last September in Sacramento calling for the establishment of sustainable groundwater management plans, if you owned the land, you owned the water, or had access to as much as you wanted, as long as you used it, quote unquote, for beneficial purposes. Well, that meant agriculture. And over the last 4 years of the drought, and especially since that legislation was passed, it gives people 5 to 7 years to come up with those management plans, and meanwhile, it's business as usual. Unless you're a county like Ventura County, which passed a moratorium on new wells until that plan's in place. But they're one of the only counties in the state that did that. All the rest of them, you get your permit, you drill your well. And the deeper your pockets, the deeper your well. And there is a rush to the bottom going on in California right now that has the potential for sucking this state dry in a few years, especially if the climate change that's being predicted continues as it is. Well, what's the solution? Well, you drive across the San Joaquin Valley, and these signs say who caused the problem. Not agriculture. It's Congress. We're starting to get into the politics of food systems, the politics of water, the place where supposedly change happens, right? And you think about this little spot in the Cuyama Valley of northern Santa Barbara County, 50, 60 miles east of Santa Maria on your way to the San Joaquin Valley. Farming in the desert, an area that probably has, especially the last several years, less than 3 or 4 inches of rain a year. And they're growing water-intensive vegetable crops, especially carrots. Probably, what did I read? 20,000 of the 60,000 acres being grown of carrots in the Cuyama Valley are organic. And the water they're using, based on a USGS groundwater study that was just completed this last summer for this area, a 5-year study showing that in the last 20 years, groundwater depletion and subsidence of the groundwater system has accelerated and is accelerating year by year based on this agriculture. Well, something has to change, and right now the critical factor is going to be water use in conventional agriculture in California with the trends in climate that we're seeing happen now. But it's going to require some real different action. And I think maybe a way of thinking about this is our own personal action, our own farm in the Cuyama Valley, not too far from those big organic, over-irrigated carrot plots, where we have a 20-acre farm. We're growing 5 acres of grapes and olives. Robbie's the pruner of the olives. I prune the grapes, although we share it back and forth, but it's a family affair. We're off the grid. Everything's solar, including a little pump in the well. But what we're doing is dry farming, an old traditional practice, still used in most of Southern Europe. In fact, there are places in Southern Europe where it's illegal to irrigate because it changes the quality of the grapes and hence the quality of the wine. And a dry farm grape produces a different kind of grape and a different kind of wine. And it uses, even though you can see we have a little backup drip system on every plant, that we use mostly to simulate rainfall when we don't get it. And boy, for the last 4 years, we haven't been getting it. So we've had to add some. But even when we do that, we use probably about 5% of the amount of water that a conventional vineyard will use. It's a real different system. You can see they're just creating the dust mulch. That's what it's called, actually. A dry layer of soil that we cultivate after the last rains, and it creates a barrier between the moisture in the soil below and the air above. It's like pinching a straw. It breaks capillarity so that water can't pull on the column of water, and it seals the water into the soil. But you need to get rainfall in the wintertime to recharge that water, and that's been the challenge for us. But you can see the traditional head-trained, freestanding plants rather than on wires. Again, the old traditional practice. Learning from the old traditional ways of planting and adapting it to today. And our harvests are community events too, where we have lots of former students and friends and family and everybody else pitches in. And then our main sales point is the farmers markets in Santa Cruz and our little wine club and stuff. And there's 3 generations of us. And this is where the key piece is going to be, though, making sure that the passion that Robbie and I have for doing this gets picked up and carried on by the next generations. And I think our son and his wife are mostly just busy raising the family and paying the mortgage, but hopefully we'll get Mateo out there running the show. Something to think about. I want to throw this at you. Buckminster Fuller, kind of a pretty radical architect, used this philosophy in his design of new architecture. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that's in a sense where I think agroecology is right now, as we develop this incredible network of small farms, and you've heard about some of them, and different kinds of market relationships, a relationship-based direct connection between the grower and the eater, and a whole understanding of how important food systems are, not just for the people who grow the food and eat the food, but for our planet, in terms of how those landscapes provide so much beyond just the food that comes from them. So expanding our definition and giving it more of that action orientation, where it's really participatory action and change that brings sustainability, security, and resilience to all parts of the food system, the ecological parts, the economic parts, and the social parts. Now, that means, of course, agroecology is a science, agroecology is a practice, and It's a social change movement. Now, the ideal agroecologist is doing all three. Now, that might not be possible for everyone. We're lucky, I think, in the way our sort of connection to and immersion in agroecology is developed, so that I really have been able to do all three, and I keep trying to do them. And it's in seeing it, kind of defending it and creating it as an approach to bringing together this network of knowledge of different ways of doing, thinking, and being in a food system. Gosh, agroecology gives us that background. So you really need to have all three to be agroecology in the way we're thinking about it. And I think all of you are in a unique position, knowing now that you have this tool called agroecology, and where you can insert yourself in the food system and create the change from being a grower to being an eater. They're all parts of the change process. And spreading that out and creating a network of support for an alternative set of policies and moving it up then through the system that creates change. I think you can do it all, and it just needs a commitment and action and a vision for doing it. But at the same time, we're in a crazy time. It's a bit freaky with this wireless technology. What's going to hold us up? We were so dependent upon the old way of doing things, the conventional way of doing things. We're really moving into something that almost is unknown, but it's really known. We just have to reinvent it and reapply it. So kind of my vision for agroecology as a global movement includes components like this, where it builds a diverse, multifunctional system. It ensures food security, sovereignty, choice, and justice. It supports this local food movement. It respects local knowledge that goes along with that local food movement. And it especially empowers women and youth, who too often are excluded. And ecologically, economically, and socially, these systems are sustainable in all of these areas simultaneously. It's going to favor small and medium farm systems, and I expect in some of the questions following this we'll have a chance to explore that a little more. But I know that if I were doing much more than 5 acres, I couldn't handle it at our place. There's a scale at which I can attend everything, and I can know every plant, and I can know every gopher in the system so that it works. And I think when you lose that stewardship ability by scaling up too much, then you start becoming dependent upon those external inputs that we've been talking about trying to replace. And finally, something called food democracy is a core value. Food democracy, where we really do have a voice and a choice in what goes on. But I'll throw this at you here sort of towards the end. That's Farmer John in his bedroom, and chickens up there with their again, why is it that the revolution always gets this far and then everyone just chickens out? No chicken out allowed now in this movement. And a few references just to be thinking about. You might know about a lot of these. The IASTAD report of 2007, an intergovernmental report with about 150 scientists working together, proposing what goes on, what happens beyond the crossroads that agriculture is in. And agroecology is a big part of the solution. Or the most recent UN Rapporteur Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, who really stood up and spoke for this right to food and how agroecology was and is the main way to move towards sustainability in the systems. And just last September, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations held, for the first time ever, a symposium on agroecology for nutrition and food security. And I remember at the end of it, the director of FAO standing up and saying this, we've just opened a little window in the cathedral of the Green Revolution called FAO with this conference. And now they're holding regional conferences in 3 parts of the world in agroecology, looking beyond the conventional approach, especially the Green Revolution or the genetically modified approach. And just recently, this group called the International Panel of Experts for Sustainable Food Systems, IPES Food, has been developed. There's the website for it that just kind of a couple weeks ago, where this group is actually taking on this job of confronting the dominant power in our food systems with a political agroecology approach to create alternative policies to support the transition from level 1 through to level 5 that I just finished talking about. The change is happening. It's coming. But we need every one of you to be part of it in this process. Here's some contacts for you to think about. My own, our nonprofit, the Community Agroecology Network, even our little farm, if you want to follow what we're doing there, and then the Agroecology website, which lists the principles and approaches and some case studies for what agroecology is all about. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention, and let's have some questions. Thank you. I'll take this.
Sorry, I'm taking notes still.
Like a good journalist.
That was really intense, Steve. Really great. I want to try to, I think I want to try to tease a couple things out of here that I hope are not offensive and are maybe helpful. I'm right in saying nothing is truly sustainable, right? We can approach sustainability, we can't achieve sustainability, at least if we're trying to grow food.
That is a good question, and I've always thought of sustainability as a goal, as a process, something we're working towards. Of course, by the time we get to where we think we'll want to be, things will have changed and they'll need to be moving to the next phase. Because I've learned that, I think, from small farmers who every year do something a little different. They'll see what works and what doesn't work. They're constantly selecting and adapting and choosing and moving because they're in a changing environment and a changing culture and a changing set of conditions that really drive for change. But what's been frustrating a little bit over the years is how the term sustainability has been misused and used for just about anything. You know, and when it takes on something, well, that someone will say, well, I've been doing it for 20 years, it must be sustainable. But when you look at it agroecologically, you know it's not. And so there's the difference. But it's still a useful term. It really gives us a way of looking at indicators of health of a system, health at all levels, from ecological to economic to social.
Can you scientifically pretend that a system is a closed system and see what's being lost and measure sustainability that way?
Oh, we've done that with several agroecosystems where we know the input-output relationships with a whole lot of different components, from nutrients to water to other aspects, what we put in, what we take out, what nature adds, what we add, and how they impact processes. Now, you know, agroecosystems are, you know, have a structure and a set of functions. And those functions are everything from nutrient cycling to biological control to other aspects of how the system works. And then the structure in which all that happens, we can understand it as well. So we really do have tools in ecology that I think we can use to understand that element of sustainability pretty well. I mean, we can talk about soil health and measure it and watch it change over time.
You took me to see a milpa, a couple actually, and you talk about the three sisters as if it were a holy trinity. What makes it so? What makes it? I'm sure there are other systems around the world that approach the same thing, but what makes these close to truly sustainable? What makes them ideals to approach?
Well, we can look towards the past, number one, and realize those systems have been functioning for millennia. That's one indicator of sustainability. Another is you look at the families and the communities that still maintain and nurture and manage those systems, and as you yourself tasted in the kitchen when we were in that community, it produces an incredible richness of material for an incredible gastronomic experience. All local, all part of the culture, and that piece itself. And then just with our understanding, when I say the milpa and the corn, beans, and squash, the corn, beans, and squash are just a small part of that system. We saw all the other things that were growing there as well. Some of them edible, some of them just important because they produced organic matter, or they attracted a beneficial insect, or it served as a repellent or something. It was all part of a system. You know, it's as complex as can be.
Right, that was my next comment. You speak of it as if it's beans, corn, and squash, which is a foundation, of course, but it is thousands of years of what now we'd call technology, development of technology.
Oh, yeah. It is. It's something we always used to refer to as traditional agricultural technology, because it does have a technology, maybe an eco-technology or an agro-eco-technology, if you want to call it that. But also, as you move from one part of Mexico to another, and one country to another, where the Mayan base is so strong and corn is the key, and beans and squash are in some way or another associated, you'll see in some places it's two of them and not the third. Or they're planted in the same hole in one place, all the seed together. Or they're interplanted at some space. Or maybe the corn's planted first, and when they double the corn over, getting ready to let it dry in the field, then they'll come in and plant the beans. It's just every mixture you can imagine. But when we start looking at those systems from an agroecological perspective, we begin seeing the relationships, the interconnections, the interdependencies between the parts, how they actually function, and the role that the people play in making sure they do.
Each of those changes is not random. None of those changes is random. Each is adapting the technique to the soil, the climate.
Well, and what they, I remember once there was a weed that seemed like it was causing harm to the crop. It was inhibiting it in some way, and I asked the farmer, well, what's it doing? He said, oh, it's heating the soil, which is hurting the corn. And we took a thermometer and stuck it out there, and there wasn't any difference. But later on, we did studies that showed that plant was actually producing chemicals that was releasing into the soil that was affecting the corn. So there's a scientific basis as to why it happened. Do we need to know that science? I say yes, because combining it with the observation, the experience of the people, with our understanding of the mechanism, we have a much better understanding of how to put the two together so that it works to the advantage for the farmer.
Well, you may need to know the science. He may not need to know the science.
Well, he has a different science. It's an empirical, local science, right. Type of knowledge. I remember one time too, we thought that if we go out and interview some of the farmers about which were their worst weeds, the malezas, más malas, and the poor student that went out there with his little interview sheet and stuff, and he asked the farmer, the first one he came to, he said, which are your worst weeds? And the farmer turned to him and said, that word weed, we don't use it. It's all monte, which is kind of green stuff. And there's buen monte and there's mal monte. And we manage it accordingly. There's some that actually switch back and forth between the two. And all had to do with use and interaction and impact and stuff that they had observed over many, many years. So that happened real early in the time I was working in southern Mexico, and it was probably a big impact on how we approach these systems after that.
You touched on this. I'd like you to unpack it a little bit for me, and I think some other people too. Organic is not necessarily agroecological. Agroecology is not necessarily organic. Organic is not necessarily sustainable. Agroecology is as close as can be to sustainable. Can you run through some of that a little bit?
I like to think of organic as a way of farming. And we can look at it agroecologically and understand the mechanisms of its work, of its functioning, and the dynamics of the soil and the interactions of insects and how weeds may be an integral part of the system. Some are good and some aren't. And which mixtures work best and which don't, and what kinds of rotations and cover crops. All the organic practices can tell me how that agroecosystem is organized and how it's functioning. The agroecology piece can get in and look at the structure and function of that system being managed organically. So organic is a way to apply agroecology for me. Just as permaculture is another way to apply agroecology with a different approach and a different arrangement of species and a different goal in the end. See, the agroecology focus is a food system approach from the seed and the soil all the way to the table and everything in between. We're looking at not just what's going on the farm, but what's going on elsewhere in the food system as food moves from the farm through processing, through marketing, to consumption, and then potentially back again, if we really want to close food system cycles. So we don't get trapped by certifications that say, well, that's organic, it must be good. You got to go behind the label, behind the certification, and really look at all the elements of what that system needs in order to truly be sustainable from, again, the seed and the soil all the way to the table. Just as I've seen the organic, who's the biggest marketer of organic produce in the world right now? 25% of the volume of the market, more or less? Walmart. And are the farmers getting a fair price? Are the workers in those fields getting treated well, making a living wage? Is it creating opportunity for young people in getting into agriculture? These are all questions that I bet.
Is it sustainable?
Yeah, would tell you that that's not a sustainable system.
Last question for me, and then we'll open it to students. Is there a better word? Is there a better word than agroecology? Because sometimes I think, first of all, I guess the good thing about agroecology is it hasn't been co-opted like everything else. But A, it doesn't trip off the tongue, and B, it takes a lot of explanation. And I wonder if, we have a lot of real geniuses in this room, so maybe someone else will come up with something, but, and I'm sure you've thought about this long and hard, but I wonder if there isn't something, it's not only a marketing question, it's an understanding question.
I don't think there's a better word. What's needed is better understanding of the roots of that word, where it comes from, what it integrates, and the impact it can have. To me, it's something I call transdisciplinary. It links different ways of knowing. It's a holistic way of thinking, like ecology itself. And there's really no better word than ecology for understanding nature. Just like I don't think there's any better way to understand food systems than agroecology because of its holistic approach. It's a matter of learning how to use it. And that's why in some of the work we're doing now, it's important to define agroecology in all three of those areas that I mentioned: science, practice, and social change, and ensure that all three are there. Because it would be really easy to just do the science, and work on some small little organism that's a problem and find a way to eliminate it and call it agroecology. But if it's not linked to practice, if it wasn't something farmers wanted to have done, and it didn't contribute to improving the sustainability of the whole system, it's not agroecology. So a lot of it's, to me, learning how to use the term. And I'm seeing it as people talk about agroecological practices, like just in the last few years, as important, and seeming to have an understanding of what they are without having to define them. And it's something more than organic. It's something more than what we've worked with. And what it needs, though, is that continued focus on sustainability of all components of the food system.
Is there broad agreement among people who call themselves agroecologists? All would pretty much agree with what you just said?
The ones that I would call agroecologists, yes.
But for example, without getting too crazy about it, if I asked Olivier that question,
Yeah,
he would say yeah.
he would say yes.
Okay. If I asked Ricardo that question, he would say yeah.
I think you would.
Yeah, okay.
Right, Ricardo?
All
right.
Questions? I don't know, how are we doing this? We have microphones, we only have one. Well, I don't need this. So we have 2 microphones, and if you, oh, okay. So I'll stop yelling. We have 2 microphones. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll start with the gentleman in the middle here.
Hello. So I have a question. This is you describe this as a movement, something that needs to happen, something that needs to go forward and propagate and become more popular and eventually change the entire world's food system, which is like obviously a great goal. One question I have though is that there's a reason that Walmart sells 25% of the organic produce, and that is because the vast majority of people can't afford to consistently buy. I mean, I'm assuming that the food that is produced in these methods comes with a heavy price tag. Maybe I'm wrong about that. So what is your solution? Because obviously to really change the entire food system, we need to find a way that everyone can afford this type of produce and food. And so what is your solution or goal in that regard?
That's always the question that's asked, and it's a really important one to ask. And in some ways, I think the impression that agroecologically produced food, or food that comes from an agroecosystem that's sustainable, is going to have a high price tag, is not correct. You really need to take a look, first of all, at the power structure that's created the control of the market of things like Walmart. I'm not picking on them particularly, but they're easy to pick on. But where things seem cheap, even the organic stuff they're selling has a low price. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, a lower price than conventional, depending on the market season and a bunch of other things. And so we really need to create different relationships in markets where the folks in the middle who are taking most of the profit spread that profit out to the 2 extremes that I talked about, the growers and the eaters. And if you're buying directly from farmers, doesn't it make sense that you should be getting a better price? And if you're not, something's not right. And a lot of it in farmers markets, the reasons I think the prices are higher a lot of the times is because their volume is so low. And farmers have fixed costs in their overhead, and they have to meet them. And when a farmer goes to a farmer's market and he or she goes home and has to take half of what they brought with them, you got to charge more for the stuff you sold, because there's not enough people at the market to buy it all, which would allow you to buy at lower prices. It's just that the market structure needs to change. It needs to be more direct, it needs to be fairer, it needs to be based on relationships directly between the growers and the eaters. And otherwise, the other system, which can operate on economy of scale and volume and control of the market, especially control the price they pay the farmers, are going to continue to suppress prices, number one. And there is a lot of discussion and things written about the fact that the true cost of food is not reflected in what you pay for it in the big supermarkets. It's an artificially induced price because so many of the externalities of soil erosion, of pesticide resistance buildup, of health problems, of obesity, of hunger, aren't included in the price at all. And they're going to need to be in the long term. Mm-hmm. But there'll be less of those problems if the system is redesigned to function on agroecological principles and truly reflect sustainability, so that those costs will come down too.
Can I ask a follow-up question, which is sort of relates to the Buckminster Fuller quote you put up? There's a moral argument here. And I think many of us have come to believe that those of us who can afford right now, I think that right now it is arguable that, let's say, fair food is more expensive. Uh-huh. It's more expensive when it costs more cash. Mm-hmm. The externalities are not visible to many of us. Mm-hmm. Many of us are aware of the externalities. There's a moral imperative for those of us who can afford to pay for fairer food to do so. But it's really only a moral imperative at this point. I mean, it's arguably better for us also, but that is a small part of the big picture.
Yeah.
I guess that wasn't a question. Sorry. I mean, feel free to.
Well, what you're saying is that, again, we have a market system that we're all part of and have to follow to a certain extent until we develop the alternatives. And I think of an alternative like, last year we did our short course in Vermont. No, 2 years ago. And they have a wonderful farmers market in downtown Burlington. 2 days of the week. It's a big tourist thing. Hundreds of people come to it. You can even test homemade gin. Good stuff. Apart from the maple syrup, which is good stuff. Yeah, but the farmers that come to that market Saturday and Sunday, on Monday, what they didn't sell, which is usually still good stuff, and they'll maybe harvest some more if they sold out some stuff, they sell it in a part of town where people have less resources, and they sell it at prices they can afford. It's a commitment on the part of the farmers. The farmers themselves organized it to go to this community, this area of Burlington where people can't afford the prices of Saturday and Sunday at the downtown market. And I think that's an example of the ways, again, relationships and commitments can lead to overcoming this price differential that we see in so many of these systems today.
Okay, I won't ask any more questions. Who's next?
We have a question from one of our viewers. Would the study of trade agreements like NAFTA and the upcoming Trans-Pacific Partnership be considered part of agroecology?
My answer to that's yes. I mean, we need to understand how some of these trade relationships have impact all the way down to the individual farm level. I mean, I watched it happen in Mexico as the NAFTA impacted small corn growers with a country that up until the early 70s was a net exporter of corn, now imports probably 70% of its corn or more. Yeah, and a lot of the traditional milpa systems have been lost as a result. And the livelihoods of those farmers has been lost. It's just the free trade agreements in the agricultural sector are usually designed to favor large commodity crops and large farming operations. And our knowledge of how they negatively impact local food systems is pretty well documented. And for me, if I think about cultural and social sustainability, a strong enough argument to say that they should not exist. That's part of the political agroecology, the understanding how power structures operate and how do we create policy, alternative policy that can overcome and counteract and move us back into a direction of sustainability with such policies. And I think that IPES food that I mentioned is going to be one of those movements, one part of that movement.
What are the economic factors that prevent dry farming from being much more widely practiced?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the economic factors that keep dry farm systems from being more widely accepted? And they are primarily economic, because you might have noticed that our plants are 10 by 10 foot space, one apart from the other, when a conventional vineyard is probably 3 feet between plants in the row and 4 feet between rows. The density of grape plants per acre is 6 and 7 times what ours is. Hence, the volume of production is many, many times beyond ours. And so the bottom line there is much much different. It's a small scale, not focused on volume, but focused more on quality and protection of the resources that we're depending upon. So to get large scale systems that are hooked into that economic model, to back off of the production focus and integrate an agroecological focus, unless there's some real changes in policy, and maybe in California with the water issue right now, and a lot of the large-scale vineyards that are responsible for sucking water down in the ground table, their new regulations are going to stop that. And when that happens, they're going to have to redesign their systems. And the redesign for California is going to be moving towards some kind of dry farm, less water-dependent kind of agriculture. But then that's going to have to also then connect into a different kind of market structure that supports that happening, because there'll be less return per acre. That's a hard one for people to think about, but it's going to happen.
Over here in the middle. Thank you for coming. I appreciated your examples of these more diversified tropical agroecosystems, and you touched on the sort of semi-arid Mediterranean example of the olive, grape, wheat system. But I wanted to ask you about your experience as a grower in a somewhat similar system, and what have been the challenges and limitations of diversifying your system beyond wine grapes or even grapes and olives?
Well, I think as we move across a gradient of tropical rainfall to an arid, temperate climate, I think that the total diversity, the total number of species you can have probably drops as well, but you can still maintain a diverse system with kinds of plants and animals that are adapted to that location. Again, I go to nature as my model, and when I see a diverse landscape of chaparral and oak woodlands and grasslands and all, it tells me that that system can handle a lot of diversity, and not just in the plants, and the animals as well. At our own system, if I were there 100% of the time, which I'm not, we could really diversify our system way beyond just grapes and olives. There are a whole range of different kinds of fruit trees, from things we're used to in terms of almonds and pistachios and apples and pomegranates and jujube and all sorts of stuff that you could add to it. And you could have bees and do honey, and you could have animals that grazed in the vineyard at some times of the year, and all this. There are lots of opportunities for diversification, but it's all site specific. And yes, the tropics are the most diverse, but tropical vegetation is the most diverse. And we look at farming systems and we see a gradient. But it seems like in temperate areas is where we've been the most successful, if you want to call it that, in simplifying those systems down to single crop, large scale monocultures. So when we start looking at the costs of doing that in terms of inputs and impacts, then we realize that we're interfering quite a bit with natural process in order to maintain that simplified system. There's lots of potential. And I've seen some work done in Nebraska on how to bring diversity back into those systems. Be it, for example, perennial grains rather than annual grains. Can you imagine the difference in that, where you plant your grain once every 7 years and harvest every year, rather than taking it back to bare soil and replanting corn, or soybeans. And it's a mixture, it's an intercrop of legumes and grasses that coexist in multiple species, yet still producing a pretty good amount of grains that are harvestable and edible by us, but they're not called wheat or corn. They're called something else that we're not used to yet.
Hi, I have a question about your example regarding grapes. Do you think that large-scale production and sustainable farming are currently incompatible?
I say that the large-scale farming needs to be redesigned in order to become sustainable. So that it's not that they're incompatible, it's just that large-scale monoculture industrialized system needs, there's a whole lot of indicators that tell us where it needs to change. Where the problem is not so much in the farming system itself, but in the power structure around which that system is maintained. Be it policy, be it a market structure, be it consolidation and control of the system that the organization that owns and manages that system has and doesn't want to let go of. There's a lot of resistance to change in anything, for that matter, but especially, in our large-scale industrialized food systems that have made so much, gotten so much return from those systems that they don't want to let go of them. And all the research so much of the research that's going on is focused on maintaining those systems rather than research on alternatives. How much money does the USDA put into research on alternative systems using agroecology? A tiny bit compared to the millions that are spent still on maintaining those conventional systems. That's where policy could really change. And it's starting to, as we start to see the USDA move towards supporting at least organic research. And now, opening up to the idea of agroecology and a broader whole systems approach to the research. So, there's resistance, but it's happening at the grassroots level. And there are networks of scientists that are supporting this. The Ecological Society of America this next August has its 100th annual meeting. And as part of that Ecological Society of America, there are 3 or 4 symposia just on agroecology. Ecologists stepping up and stepping out of their work on natural systems into work in agroecosystems, using their skills and tools with that transdisciplinary, action-oriented, participatory approach.
We have another question from a viewer. What does conventional farming look like on a microbiotic scale? And what does agroecology look like on a microbiotic scale?
Now, I'm not sure what microbiotic, I mean the microbiology of the soil,
Yeah.
the microorganisms in the soil. Yeah, that, generally speaking, gosh, think of the slide I showed of a large-scale strawberry system being fumigated with methyl bromide. You can imagine there's not much left in the soil after that's done. Its diversity is super low, and usually it's the really aggressive, damaging organisms that invade first and come back and cause problems and become resistant and all that stuff. I think any of the large-scale conventional systems, which especially those that receive heavy amounts of chemical fertilizers, synthetic chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and other input types, you're working against those systems completely. And the agroecological approach, which uses organic inputs to the soil, crop rotations, cover crops, a great diversity of input types to the system, we're seeing an incredible change in the microbiology of those systems as they recolonize and redevelop the diversity of nutrient capturing, water holding, organic matter producing capacities that a healthy soil can have. Yeah, a big part of agroecology is restoring that capacity to soils.
Alistair?
With regard to changing the market structure of food production, is there a specific number of farmers or a specific percentage of the population that you think needs to be committed to agroecology to sustain the sort of system that you're talking about? And if so, how would you incentivize young people or people who are maybe interested in farming to take up those practices? Because it seems to me that only a certain percentage of the necessary farm staff would do it for the love of the thing because they like to farm. So how do we achieve the system that you're talking about and get people into farming? Because as you pointed out at the start of your slideshow, there's not as many farmers or farms committed to doing the sort of agroecology that you're talking about. So how do we, I guess, improve the ranks?
So many different ways to approach that. First of all, I saw for many years at UC Santa Cruz, in my agroecology classes and programs around organic gardening and whatnot, tons of students who wanted to go that direction. And the biggest limiting factor was access to land. They can't afford to buy it. And I know in our area where larger scale systems dominate, even renting it is almost impossible. So making land accessible And there's all sorts of programs now focused on this that link young people with interest in farming to older farmers who are getting ready to retire, and using that as a way to transfer information and eventually access to the land, especially for older people who don't have people that are going to inherit the land or don't want to go into farming. And that's especially true in peri-urban and urban systems. And creating policies to start with, where land in urban areas that's farmable, that's creating protection for them and accessibility to them. There's, again, municipalities around the country. I think, Detroit and Pittsburgh are two big cities right now that are great examples of where policy at the city level has changed to make access to land possible for people who want to farm. That's the big start. And then creating the alternative markets. Markets that are direct access, be they farmers markets, CSAs, food hubs. All these are pretty important pieces for making that ability to happen. And also respecting the fact that part-time farming is a viable way to farm and produce food, where you're doing something that maybe provides a good part of your income, but the farming part is another, so that you're not 100% dependent in a system that's so difficult to get into on farming. But you can farm, and you can start the process of getting that way as the rest of these changes we're talking about happen. And little by little, I know people that are moving away from part-time farming to full-time farming, but started that way. So there are lots of options, but it's a process, and it'll take time.
Hi, I'm going to speak on behalf of Alistair Isles with the question, but before I do that, in the way of a name for agroecology, I definitely think that there's not a good substitute, but maybe to expand the lexicon, we can make use of diversified systems that are biologically diversified, culturally and epistemically too, because we're integrating a lot of different knowledges, farmer knowledge, scientific knowledge. So if we need more language to play with, I like diversified.
Yeah.
And Alistair would like to ask, what can governments do to support agroecology other than expand investments in research?
It's always, I'm not sure I ever use agroecology all alone when I'm describing what I do or what it is. And diversified systems is always a part of that. It's like no single word is enough, I think, for about anything. And the more concepts like diversified systems and rotations and intercropping, and I like the word complexity. It's such a cool word in the sense that it's so much going on, and most people don't like it because it's kind of unpredictable, complicates things. But I love it. It's a great ecological word. Now, incentives on the policy side beyond just putting money into research kind of goes back to what I was talking about a little earlier, just in the previous question. And I think it's going to happen best at the local level. I think some of us are kind of giving up a little bit on the national level of policy right now for different reasons, because it doesn't seem to be working at all. But at the local level, local groups can influence local policy and push for access to land, push for the establishment of local market systems, push for, converting, unused buildings or unused land into things that support local food systems, push for local minimum wage standards that are livable wage standards. We see that happening at the local level that support, people working in agriculture and in food processing all the way to the table. I think there's so much at the local level that's going to have to come from the bottom up. But then ultimately, other kinds of, going back to the question about trade, we're going to need some international bodies stepping up and stepping forward with agroecology as a focus on the impacts of trade agreements, and not just be trade that supports the large corporate structure that's pushing for them to happen, but again brings forward the voice of the social movements, the voice of the consumers, the voice of the people who are affected most by these trade agreements. And there are international bodies now starting to take that on, and we need to keep supporting that as well.
We'll take one more question and we'll let Steve go.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on the role of, well, you've already commented to some extent on market pressures that create disincentives or incentives for farmers. I think that there's often knowledge that farmers feel as though they're hostages to really heavy pressures for market standardization and for particular qualities, whether it be for grains or produce or whatever, that actually often makes it very difficult for them to make changes at the local level. So I was wondering if you could comment on what you see as like the role of retailers, buyers in the international market to make any transition in those sort of rigid standards. As you know, there's an example is with the rigid market aesthetic qualities that are created by buyers that result in huge waste and difficulty in diversifying.
Mm-hmm.
So, and along that line, what sort of role can certification programs play?
Yeah.
So.
Wow. I heard sort of three questions there almost. Yeah. Just as an example, going back to the local level, Robbie, you were very much involved in the 70s in trying to get legislation passed to allow farmers markets in California. Do you imagine how hard that was to do? The Farm Bureau of California was totally against it and blocked it at every single turn. And it wasn't until groups of small farmers and consumers got together and lobbied in Sacramento that we finally got some legislation that allowed farmers markets. And now we just think, oh gosh, farmers markets, they're all over the place. But geez, the resistance to it. And the same thing's going to be happening as we move up in I guess what we'll call the food chain, or the commodity chain, of products. And we keep coming up against this resistance. Where do we find the support for the alternatives? Gosh, what was? Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention too is how do we reach the buyers, the retailers? And a lot of that's happening, I think, at the local level. Is a lot of at least local retailers, even some of the bigger ones, respect local and want to support it, and carry the local lines and allow the story to be told that makes it local, and emphasize that in what they're selling, as long as they're not taking advantage of it. And that's where, it can't just be the retailer that's telling the story. We need the producer, the processor, whoever it is there telling the story as well. And transparency in the process of how much of what the consumer pays going to the person who either grew it or processed it. And it's not just, so you're really talking about a different kind of retailer. You're talking about a community-based, supportive retailer of a local economy and of a real connection between the grower and the eater. And we've tried to do this in the coffee that comes up to be Agroeco coffee, where the retailer that we work with is a roaster, a small-scale roaster, but one with a commitment to have direct relationship, to buy directly from the grower and the grower organization, and to work with an exporter that allows that coffee to come up through less steps, so that a larger percentage, and a percentage that's beyond organic certification and beyond fair trade certification in terms of the return to the farmer organization and the farmers themselves. And that's a whole different kind of retailer. It's a retailer with a conscience, with a commitment, that's there to not just support a business, which he is, but to create an opportunity to support the communities that grow the coffee that he's supporting. That's the kind of retailer we need. And then finally, certification. Boy, it's, Agroeco coffee is not certified. It doesn't carry, well, I guess some of our growers are now organically certified, but not all. Some of them were fair trade and have dropped out of fair trade because U.S. trade, which used to be Transfair, which is Fair Trade USA now, has taken on the certification of plantation-grown coffee based on better payment to workers. But the concentration of the wealth that's created by those plantations stays in the hands of plantation owners. And it's put small-scale growers, who were the foundation and the basis for establishing fair trade, almost out of business because they can't compete with the volume coming. So it's a matter of I like to think of a community-based certification where it's more on knowledge and understanding and relationship. Goes back to reconnecting the grower and eater kind of thing, where we know. We don't need a seal. We need knowledge. We need relationship. We need connection.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you.